Chapter 4: Leading with Values When Pressure Hits. Values are easy to talk about when nothing is at stake. They sound good in meetings, they look good on walls, they show up in onboarding decks and leadership retreats. In calm moments, most managers agree on what matters: integrity, trust, accountability, respect. There's rarely a debate about the words themselves. The test comes when pressure arrives. Pressure has a way of forcing decisions faster than leaders would prefer. Timelines compress, expectations collide, resources tighten, and in those moments, values stop being aspirational and start becoming inconvenient. That's where most leaders get exposed. I used to believe that values were something you had, that if you believed in them strongly enough, they would naturally guide your decisions. What I learned instead was that values only work when they're practiced intentionally, especially when the right decision costs more in the short term. Pressure doesn't erase values, it competes with them. And competition reveals priorities. When outcomes are threatened, leaders often justify compromise. Just this once, just to get through this moment, just until things settle down. The reasoning sounds practical, even responsible. After all, the business has to survive. People are counting on results. I've made those justifications myself. I've felt the tension between what I believed was right and what I felt expedient. The pressures to protect performance, reputation, or momentum can make any value feel negotiable if the cost seems high enough. That's the danger. Because once a value becomes optional under pressure, it's no longer valuable. It's a preference. Values aren't tested when they align with convenience. They're tested when they don't. When doing the right thing takes more time, when it creates discomfort, when it forces a hard conversation instead of a quick fix, when it risks short-term results to protect long-term trust. The moments don't announce themselves as value decisions. They show up every day as leadership choices: how feedback is delivered, how mistakes are handled, how consistently standards are applied. People notice. I learned quickly that my team wasn't listening to what I said our values were. They were watching what I did when pressure hit. They paid attention to whether I stayed consistent or became situational, whether I protected people or protected outcomes, whether I addressed issues directly or avoided them to keep things moving. Every pressure decision taught me something, not about leadership theory, but about what really mattered here. Leading with values under pressure requires more than conviction. It requires clarity. Leaders who struggle to lead with values when pressure hits often haven't translated those values into behavior. They know what they believe, but they haven't decided how those beliefs show up in action. Without clarity, pressure fills the gap. That's when leaders default to habit instead of principle. For me, the shift happened when I stopped treating values as ideals and started using them as filters. Instead of asking, "What's the fastest way through this?" I began asking, "What decision reinforces the culture we're trying to build?" That question slowed me down and sharpened my thinking. Sometimes it meant choosing a harder path. Sometimes it meant addressing an issue directly instead of letting it slide. Sometimes it meant accepting short-term friction to protect long-term trust. It wasn't always popular, but it was consistent. Consistency is what gives values weight. When leaders apply values selectively, people learn to wait them out. They assume pressure will override principle eventually. When leaders apply values consistently, especially when it costs them, people begin to trust the system. Trust changes behavior. People speak up sooner. They take ownership more confidently. They make decisions without fear of being punished for honest mistakes. Values stop being words and start becoming guardrails. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that leading with values under pressure doesn't always feel good. It can feel lonely. It can feel slow. It can feel like you're swimming against the current of urgency. There were moments when I questioned whether it was worth it, whether holding the line really mattered, whether loosening standards just this once would make things easier. It would have, briefly, but ease under pressure comes at a price. Pressure rewards shortcuts, but it changes interest. Every time a leader sacrifices a value to relieve pressure, they create a debt. That debt shows up later in mistrust, disengagement, inconsistency, or cynicism. It doesn't always appear immediately, but it'll come due. Leading with values avoids that debt. It doesn't eliminate pressure, but it prevents pressure from corrupting the culture. Values-based leadership isn't rigid, it's anchored. It allows leaders to adapt tactics without compromising principles. It creates stability in uncertainty because people know what won't change, even when everything else does. That stability matters more than most leaders realize. When people trust the values of the organization, they can tolerate ambiguity. When they don't, even small changes feel threatening. I also learned that values led decisions don't require perfection. Leaders will still make mistakes. They will still misjudge situations. They will still get things wrong. The difference is how those mistakes are handled. In values driven cultures, mistakes become moments for learning, not fear. Leaders own missteps openly. They correct course without blame. They reinforce trust by showing accountability instead of defensiveness. That response teaches more than any policy ever could. Leading with values when pressure hits isn't about being idealistic. It's about being disciplined. It's about deciding in advance what you are unwilling to sacrifice and honoring that decision when it would be easiest to walk away from it. That discipline compounds. Over time, people stop asking whether leadership will be consistent. They assume it will be. They act with confidence because the rules don't change based on who's watching or how stressed leadership feels. That confidence is what allows teams to perform under pressure without fracturing. Pressure will always test leadership. It will always offer shortcuts. It will always challenge consistency. It'll always tempt leaders to choose control over values. Leaders who are built for pressure don't avoid those moments. They prepare for them. They decide ahead of time what matters most, and then they prove it when it counts. In the next chapter, we'll look at how trust is actually built in organizations, not through grand gestures, but through small, repeatable actions that either reinforce or erode credibility over time. Because values create direction, but trust is what allows people to follow. That concludes this episode of Built for Pressure. Built for Pressure is a copyrighted work by Richard Levene. All rights reserved. This content may not be reproduced, distributed, or repurposed without permission. If this episode resonated, you can find the full framework at richardlevene.com.